A wife can survive a cold husband, but not forever beside a man who mistakes her silence for emptiness. The words were not spoken aloud that night, though Clara Bennet would remember them, as if some hidden voice had whispered them into the walls of Blackthorn Hall. Rain struck the tall windows like fingertips tapping on glass, steady and patient, while the candles along the corridor burned low in their silver holders. She stood in the ducal bedchamber wearing a wedding gown that had once belonged to her mother, its ivory satin carefully altered, its lace mended by her own hands in the quiet hours before dawn. Across the room, Duke Alexander Whitmore removed his gloves with the calm precision of a man concluding a business arrangement. He was 37, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, and handsome in the severe way old portraits were handsome, all sharp lines and disciplined sorrow. He did not look at her as a bride. He looked at her as the final answer to a problem his bloodline had failed to solve. Outside, thunder rolled across the estate, shaking the panes in their black frames. Inside, neither of them moved. Clara's fingers tightened around the small pearl buttons at her wrist, though her face remained composed. She had learned composure early, in rooms where creditors spoke louder than grief, in sick rooms where her mother slept beneath thin quilts, in the hollow kitchen of a house that had once smelled of bread and apple preserves, but now smelled only of cold ashes. This marriage had saved the Bennet name from ruin. It had kept a roof over her mother's head and paid the school fees her younger brother would never know had been in danger. That was what she told herself as the Duke crossed to the fireplace and watched the flames as if they interested him more than the woman he had just married. "You understand why you are here," he said at last. His voice was low, cultured, and without cruelty only because cruelty required feeling. Clara lifted her chin. "Yes, Your Grace." He turned then, his gray eyes catching the candlelight. For a moment, she saw not arrogance but exhaustion carved deeply into him, the kind that no sleep could touch. Then the door inside him closed. "Good. Give me an heir, not conversation." The sentence fell between them with the soft finality of a key turning in a lock. Clara did not gasp. She did not weep. She did not ask if he meant it, because men like Alexander Whitmore did not waste words on accidents. The rain whispered against the glass. The fire cracked once in the hearth. Somewhere below, a clock struck midnight, each chime spreading through the old house like a warning. Clara looked at the man who was now her husband and understood with perfect clarity that Blackthorn Hall had not gained a duchess that day. It had acquired a duty in a white gown. "As you wish, Your Grace," she said. Her voice was gentle, almost too gentle for the wound he had given her. Something flickered across his face, so quickly it might have been shadow. Perhaps he had expected protest. Perhaps tears. Perhaps the ordinary pleas of a woman hoping to be seen. Clara offered none of them. She lowered her gaze, removed her gloves, and placed them neatly upon the carved table beside her bouquet. The flowers were pale roses, already bowing their heads from the heat of the candles. She wondered if all beautiful things entered Blackthorn only to learn how to wither quietly. Alexander stepped toward the door connecting his chamber to the adjoining dressing room. "The household will look to you for management in the morning. Mrs. Hale will explain what is required. Of course." He paused with his hand on the brass knob. "I value order above sentiment, Duchess." It was the first time he had called her by her new title, and somehow it sounded colder than her maiden name ever had. Clara folded her hands before her. "Then you shall have order." He looked back once, and for the briefest instant, she thought he might say something human, something small enough to fit inside the broken silence. But the moment passed. The door closed behind him with a quiet click. Clara remained where she was, surrounded by velvet drapes, dark wood, old stone, and the faint scent of rain pressed into the air. She stood there until the candle beside her trembled and went out, leaving half the room in shadow. Only then did she allow herself one breath that shook. Not a sob, not surrender, just proof that something inside her had felt the blow and chosen not to fall. By morning, the servants would find the new Duchess of Whitmore dressed in gray silk, her hair pinned neatly, her voice calm, her instructions precise. They would say she was dignified. They would say she was quiet. They would say the Duke had chosen well. None of them would know that on her wedding night, Clara Bennet had made a vow of her own. If Alexander Whitmore wanted no conversation, she would give him silence. Not the silence of a defeated woman, not the silence of an obedient child, A deeper silence. A silence with memory. A silence that would move through Blackthorn Hall room by room, candle by candle, until one day the Duke would search for her voice as a starving man searches for bread, and understand too late that the heart he had dismissed had been keeping his house alive. By the first winter morning after the wedding, Clara Whitmore understood that Blackthorn Hall did not wake gently. It stirred like an old creature disturbed from uneasy sleep, its stone corridors breathing cold through the seams of the windows, its servants moving in quiet lines beneath portraits of dead Whitmores whose painted eyes seemed to ask what right she had to stand among them. She dressed before dawn in gray silk, the plainest gown she owned, because white felt dishonest after the night before. Mrs. Hale, the housekeeper, found her in the small morning room with the estate ledgers already open before her and a candle burned halfway down beside her hand. The older woman stopped in the doorway, surprise flickering across her careful face. "Your Grace, those accounts are not expected of you so soon." Clara looked up. Her eyes were calm, though the shadows beneath them betrayed the hours she had not slept. "Blackthorn expected a duchess this morning, did it not?" Mrs. Hale lowered her gaze. "Yes, Your Grace." "Then let it have one." That was the beginning. Day by day, without announcement or complaint, Clara learned the shape of the house that had taken her name. She discovered that the west pantry wasted flour because no one checked the weekly inventory, that 3 guest rooms were kept polished though no guest had crossed the threshold in years, that the servants received wages late because Alexander's steward disliked asking the Duke to sign household orders. She found cracked windows in the nursery wing, unpaid bills from the village coal merchant, and a list of tenant families whose rents had been delayed after an early frost ruined nearly 40 acres of barley. No one had asked her to care. She cared anyway. By the end of the first month, the kitchen fires burned more steadily. By the third, the servants had new wool gloves for outdoor work. By the sixth, the children from the South cottages were receiving bread twice a week from Blackthorn's ovens, though the order appeared in the ledger under the harmless phrase household surplus. Clara never explained herself unless explanation was required. She did not speak at dinner unless Alexander addressed her first, and he rarely did. Their meals took place at opposite ends of a table long enough to make marriage feel like a rumor. Silverware chimed softly against porcelain. Rain, wind, or snow filled the spaces where conversation might have lived. Alexander read correspondence beside his untouched wine. Clara folded her napkin with patient hands and watched candlelight tremble over the dark mahogany between them. At first, the silence satisfied him. It proved she understood. It proved she would not trouble him with questions about his past, his grief, his scars of spirit that no tailor could hide. Yet as the months passed, her quietness changed its weight. It ceased to feel like obedience and began to feel like a door closed from the inside. He would enter the library and find fresh flowers placed near the window, not bright flowers, never foolish ones, but pale winter roses trimmed cleanly and set where the morning sun could touch them. He would pass the servants' hall and hear laughter soften the instant Clara's footsteps approached, not from fear, but affection. He would review estate reports and see that costs had lowered, repairs had been completed, disputes had been settled, and no one seemed able to tell him precisely when the house had stopped decaying. Her Grace handled it, became the answer to nearly everything. One evening, almost a year after the wedding, Alexander paused outside the chapel door and saw Clara kneeling alone before the altar, not praying aloud, not weeping, only replacing the burned candles with new ones from a basket at her side. Her dark blonde hair had loosened from its pins, and the candlelight rested on her fair cheek with a tenderness the house itself seemed to deny him. For reasons he could not name, he stepped back before she noticed him. Later that night at dinner, he found himself waiting for her to speak. She did not. She ate little, answered his single question about the village road with 5 measured words, and lowered her eyes again. A strange irritation moved through him. Not anger. Not exactly. Something less familiar and far less comfortable. He had asked for silence and received it with perfect grace. He had demanded a wife who would not reach for him, and she had become a moon in his own house, changing every tide while remaining impossibly distant. When Clara rose to leave, the room seemed to lose warmth before the door had even closed. Alexander sat alone beneath the chandelier, listening to the fading sound of her steps along the marble hall. For For the first time since their wedding night, he wondered what his wife might have said if he had not taught her that her voice was unwelcome. By the 12th month of their marriage, the question of an heir had ceased to be a private matter and had become a sound that followed Clara through Blackthorn Hall like a draft under a locked door. It was present in the pause after greetings, in the lowered voices of visiting matrons, in the sudden silence when she entered the drawing room. It waited for her beside the breakfast tray and beneath every letter sealed with the Whitmore crest. The house had grown warmer under her care, but warmth did not protect a woman from being measured by what she had not yet given. Duchess Margaret Whitmore arrived on a pale January afternoon with 6 trunks, 2 ladies' maids, and a face that looked carved from old ivory. Alexander's mother had not attended the wedding breakfast the year before, claiming delicate nerves and colder weather than her physician approved, but she entered Blackthorn as if she had never left it, trailing lavender perfume and judgment behind her. Clara met her in the great hall, dressed in deep blue wool, her hands folded at her waist. "Your Grace," Clara said with a curtsy graceful enough to satisfy any rule of rank. Duchess Margaret's eyes traveled over her slowly, from the smooth fairness of her face to the plain wedding band on her finger. "So this is what my son has made Duchess of Whitmore." Clara did not answer. The older woman smiled without warmth. "Quiet. That is something, at least." Alexander stood near the staircase, his expression unreadable. He offered his mother his arm and escorted her toward the sitting room, leaving Clara to follow 3 steps behind them like a thought no one wished to speak. That evening, dinner was served beneath the long gallery of ancestral portraits. Marcus Whitmore, Alexander's cousin and legal heir should no child be born, had arrived with Duchess Margaret. He was handsome in a polished, unpleasant way, with pale hair, a soft voice, and eyes that seemed always to be counting the value of things. He raised his glass to Clara with false courtesy. "To her Grace, who has improved the household accounts beautifully. A rare talent in a woman." Clara inclined her head. "You are kind to notice." "Oh, I notice everything." His smile rested too long on her face. "Though I confess, the family had hoped for a different sort of accomplishment by now." The candle flames moved as if the room itself had drawn breath. Clara felt every gaze turned toward her. Duchess Margaret lifted her teacup, though dinner had not yet reached its final course. "Marcus speaks plainly, but not incorrectly. A silent wife is tolerable. A barren one is not." The word struck the table softly. Barren, not shouted, not cruel in volume, cruel in elegance. Clara's fingers closed around the linen napkin in her lap. Across the table, Alexander's hand tightened once around the stem of his glass. She saw it. She saw, too, that he said nothing. The stillness inside her changed shape. It became colder, cleaner, almost merciful. She rose before dessert was served. "Forgive me," she said, her voice smooth as folded silk. "There are household matters requiring my attention." Duchess Margaret arched one brow. "At this hour?" Clara looked at her mother-in-law, then at Marcus, then finally at Alexander. "Some duties do not become less necessary because they are invisible." She curtsied and left the room without haste. No door slammed behind her. No tears disgraced the corridor. Only the soft rhythm of her steps moved through the hall, steady and diminishing, until even that was gone. Alexander remained seated, but the meal had turned to ash in his mouth. His mother resumed speaking of bloodlines, physicians, obligations, the duty of noble houses to continue. Marcus added observations dressed as concern. Alexander heard none of it clearly. He was listening instead to the absence Clara had left behind. Later, he found her in the linen room, alone beneath a single lamp, folding blankets for the tenant families whose cottages lay 3 miles beyond the north field. Snow pressed white against the small window. Her sleeves were rolled to the wrist. Her wedding ring glimmered faintly as she worked. "You should not have been spoken to that way," he said. Clara did not look up. Yet I was. The answer was quiet, without accusation, and for that reason it cut deeper. Alexander stepped inside. "My mother can be severe. Your mother can be honest." He frowned. "That is not what I meant." Clara placed one folded blanket atop another. "No, Your Grace. It rarely is." The room seemed too small for him then, though he had stood in battle rooms, court chambers, and halls of law without discomfort. "Do you have nothing else to say?" he asked. At last she lifted her eyes to his. They were not angry. That was the worst of it. They were tired in a way he had not earned the right to comfort. You asked me for no conversation. A log shifted somewhere in a distant fireplace. The sound echoed faintly through the walls. Alexander could find no reply. Clara picked up the basket of blankets and moved past him, close enough that he caught the scent of clean linen and winter air. He did not stop her. He had commanded silence from a woman who knew how to make obedience feel like judgment. And as he watched her disappear into the corridor, he understood that the air he had wanted was no longer the only thing missing from Blackthorn Hall. The secret Clara carried had not begun as a secret. It had begun as an accident, folded into a cream envelope and placed in the wrong hand on a rain-dark Tuesday in March. Dr. Elias Warren had come to Blackthorn Hall to examine Alexander after a fever kept him from court for nearly a week. The Duke had dismissed the matter as inconvenience, but Mrs. Hale, pale with worry, had sent for the physician anyway. Clara had not entered the examination room. She had no wish to intrude where she had never been invited. She had waited in the blue parlor with a tray of untouched tea, listening to the rain slide down the windows and the old clock count each minute, as if time itself disapproved of the house. When Dr. Warren left, hurried and distracted, he handed Clara a sealed note. "For His Grace," he said. "A private medical memorandum." He asked that it be delivered without delay. Clara carried it to Alexander's study, but he had already ridden out despite the weather, leaving only the smell of wet wool and extinguished fire behind him. She placed the envelope upon his desk. A gust from the cracked window stirred the papers there, scattering letters across the carpet. Clara moved to gather them, and the physician's note slipped open where the seal had not held. She meant only to close it. She read only because the first line caught her name's future by the throat. The wound sustained during the winter campaign may have permanently diminished His Grace's capacity to father a child. For a long moment, the room made no sound. Not the rain, not the clock, not Clara's breath. She stood with the paper in her hand, understanding at once what the world would do with such knowledge. Men who feared Alexander would call him incomplete. Relatives who wanted Blackthorn would call him unfit. Marcus would smile with sympathy and sharpen the truth into a weapon. Duchess Margaret would rather destroy another woman than admit her son's bloodline might end with him. Clara folded the note exactly as she had found it and left it on the desk. She never mentioned it. Not that evening when Alexander returned with mud on his boots and frost in his expression. Not months later when no child came. Not when servants whispered prayers for a nursery still empty. Not when physicians were suggested for her. Tonics were sent to her, and Duchess Margaret looked at Clara as though she were a locked gate standing between the Whitmore name and eternity. Silence became the only shield she owned large enough to cover him. She told herself it was not love. Love was too dangerous a word for a house built on command and restraint. It was mercy. It was duty. It was perhaps the last dignity she could give a man who had never asked for tenderness and would not have known what to do with it if it had been placed in his hands. Still, mercy was heavy. It bent the shoulders in ways no one saw. In the months that followed, Clara learned to stand calmly while blame gathered around her like snow. She smiled at visiting ladies who recommended seaside air, special diets, warmer rooms, quieter prayers. She thanked them as if each suggestion were a kindness and not another small stone laid upon her chest. At night, she wrote to her mother in careful sentences, never mentioning the coldness of Blackthorn or the ache of being accused without trial. She sent money when she could and kept only enough for thread, candles, and postage. The rest went into places Alexander never noticed. Winter coal for the north cottages, a new roof for the schoolhouse, medicine for old Mr. Bell who had served the Whitmores for 40 years and could no longer climb the stairs without trembling. One afternoon, Clara found Marcus in the portrait gallery, standing before the painting of Alexander's grandfather. "You are very loyal to a family that has not been kind to you," he said. Clara stopped several feet away. Gray light filtered through the tall windows, softening nothing. "Kindness is not the measure of duty." Marcus turned with a smile. "No, but usefulness is. And a duchess without a child has a brief season of usefulness." Clara met his eyes. "Then I shall make good use of the season I have." His smile thinned. "You are calmer than most women would be. Perhaps most women are given reason to speak." She walked past him before he could answer, her steps even on the polished floor. That night, Alexander saw her from the library window crossing the courtyard with a basket on her arm, her cloak drawn tight against the wind. She was walking toward the servants' cottages though snow had begun to fall, small white flecks gathering in her hair. He watched until she disappeared beyond the archway. Something tightened in him, not quite concern and not quite shame. He turned back to his desk and found Dr. Warren's old memorandum beneath a stack of estate documents, still unopened by him after all these months. The seal was broken. His name waited on the folded page like judgment. For reasons he did not yet understand, Alexander did not open it. He only looked toward the dark window where Clara's reflection should have been and felt, for the first time, afraid of what his wife's silence might have cost her. Alexander had not always distrusted a woman's voice. There had been a time, years before Clara entered Blackthorn Hall, when he believed words could be windows and not snares, when a laugh across a garden path could lift the weight from his shoulders for an entire day. Her name had been Evelyn Hart, the daughter of a respected advisor, all golden charm and bright intelligence, with a talent for making every secret feel safe in her keeping. She had listened when Alexander spoke of his father's failing health, of the pressure surrounding the Whitmore inheritance, of the fears he never admitted before councilmen or cousins. She had touched his sleeve beneath the linden trees and told him that even dukes deserved to be understood. He had been young enough to believe her. By the end of that autumn, private details of the estate had reached men who wished to profit from Whitmore weakness. Contracts were challenged. Debts were exaggerated. A false rumor spread that Alexander's father intended to alter the succession, and Marcus, smiling even then from the edges of family gatherings, benefited from every whisper. Evelyn vanished into a comfortable marriage 2 counties away, leaving behind a short letter filled with tender phrases and no apology. Alexander kept the letter for 1 week, then burned it in the library hearth and watched each graceful sentence turn black at the edges. From that day forward, he decided that speech was where betrayal dressed itself beautifully. Silence could not flatter. Silence could not promise devotion and sell a man's trust before supper. Silence, he believed, was honest. Then Clara came, and her silence unsettled every certainty he had built. She did not use words to win favor. She did not fill his rooms with soft complaints. She did not praise him, plead with him, or arrange her sorrow where he might trip over it. Yet everywhere he turned, evidence of her remained. A repaired ledger, a warmed hallway, a servant less afraid, a tenant child wearing boots that fit. She had become, impossibly, the quiet pulse of Blackthorn. And the more Alexander noticed, the more he hated the memory of the sentence he had given her on their wedding night. On the evening after he found Dr. Warren's unopened memorandum, snow began falling over the estate with a gentleness that made the world look innocent. Alexander left the library earlier than usual, the folded notes still locked in his desk, and moved through the corridors without calling for his valet. Voices drifted from the servants' stair, hushed but warmer than any conversation he had heard at his own table. He followed the sound without intending to. Near the old chapel, he stopped. The door was partly open, and inside, Clara sat alone beneath the amber glow of 3 candles, a basket of mending at her feet. The chapel had not been used for family worship in years. Dust lay in the corners. The stained glass window above the altar showed a pale saint holding lilies, her colored face dimmed by winter dark. Clara had spread small shirts and stockings across the front pew, stitching neat seams by candlelight. Her gown was plain brown wool, her sleeves rolled carefully, her hair pinned low at the nape of her neck. She looked less like a duchess than a woman who had forgotten rank because need had entered the room. Alexander should have left. Instead, he watched as the needle slipped and pricked her finger. A single bead of red appeared against her fair skin. She drew in a quiet breath, but made no sound. Before he could stop himself, he stepped inside. Clara looked up at once, and the stillness that came over her felt practiced, almost defensive. "Your Grace." He crossed the chapel slowly. "You are bleeding." "It is nothing. Give me your hand." The words came out more command than request. He heard it too late. Clara hesitated, then placed her hand lightly in his. Her fingers were cold from the stone air, smaller than he expected, roughened at the tips from work no duchess should have needed to do. He took a clean handkerchief from his coat and pressed it gently around the tiny wound. Neither of them spoke. The candle flame moved between them, trembling in its cup of brass. Alexander looked down at her hand and felt an unfamiliar shame rise in him. Not dramatic, not sudden, but deep and steady, like water filling a locked room. "Do you do this often?" he asked. "When there is mending to be done. We employ seamstresses. For gowns, curtains, and things visitors can see." Her eyes lowered to the basket. Children's stockings are rarely considered urgent by anyone not wearing them. He studied her face. "Are you afraid of me, Clara?" It was the first time in months he had spoken her given name. Her lashes lifted. For a moment, the chapel seemed to hold its breath. "No, Your Grace." The answer should have relieved him. It did not. She carefully withdrew her hand from his and folded the handkerchief over her finger herself. "I simply remember what you asked of me." The words were not sharp. They were worse. They were faithful. Alexander stood very still as Clara returned to her needle, not dismissing him, not inviting him, only continuing the quiet work he had never valued because it had never announced itself. He looked at the mended garments, the dim altar, the pale curve of her bowed head, and understood that Evelyn had used words to disguise emptiness, while Clara used silence to hide an ocean. The knowledge did not free him. It condemned him. When he left the chapel, he carried the image of her cold hand in his own as if it had marked him. And for the first time since he was a younger man beneath the linden trees, Alexander Whitmore wanted to hear a woman speak not because he distrusted her silence, but because he feared he had made it necessary. The days after the chapel changed nothing that anyone at Blackthorn Hall could name, and yet everything had altered by half an inch. Alexander still rose before dawn, still received estate reports in the library, still wore his authority like a dark coat buttoned to the throat. Clara still managed the household with quiet precision, still answered questions in measured phrases, still moved through the corridors like a candle protected by glass. But he had begun to look for her. Not openly. Not with the desperation of a man willing to be seen needing anything. He noticed the hour she crossed the courtyard to visit the cottages. He noticed that she took tea without sugar and left most cakes untouched unless Mrs. Hale was watching. He noticed that when Duchess Margaret entered a room, Clara's shoulders did not stiffen. They settled, as if she had long ago accepted the shape of every blow before it arrived. This troubled him more than fear would have. Fear could be answered with reassurance. Resignation required repentance. Marcus noticed the change before Alexander understood it himself. One afternoon, 3 weeks after the snowfall, the family gathered in the south drawing room for tea with 2 neighboring ladies and the local vicar's wife. The room was handsome in winter light, all dark green drapes, polished rosewood, and a fire burning low beneath the marble mantel. Clara sat near the window, pouring tea with hands so steady no one would have guessed how often those same hands had repaired what the house neglected. Duchess Margaret spoke of lineage with the pleasant cruelty of a woman who believed good manners could perfume any unkindness. "In families such as ours, continuity is not a wish," she said, placing a gloved hand on her cane. "It is an obligation." One of the visiting ladies murmured agreement. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his smile mild. "Obligation does require cooperation from nature." The words were soft, but the room heard them. Clara placed a cup upon its saucer without a sound. Alexander's eyes moved to her face. She did not blush. She did not lower her head. She only looked at the tea service as though silver required all her attention. That old silence. That impossible grace. Duchess Margaret sighed. "I have written to Dr. Warren. A full examination should have been arranged months ago." Clara's hand paused for the smallest fraction of a second. Alexander saw it because he had begun to see too much. "An examination of whom?" he asked. His mother looked at him as if the answer were beneath stating. "Your wife, of course." The fire cracked in the grate. Clara lifted the teapot again, though no cup had been offered. Alexander felt the room tilt toward him, waiting to see whether he would protect the dignity of the woman who had protected his without being asked. Marcus spoke before he could. "Surely her grace cannot object, unless she fears the truth." Clara looked up then, not at Marcus, not at Duchess Margaret, but at Alexander. Her eyes held no plea. That was what nearly undid him. She would accept whatever he allowed. She had been accepting it for a year. Alexander set his cup down. The small sound carried. "There will be no public discussion of the Duchess's private health." Duchess Margaret's expression hardened. "Alexander." No, it was not loud. It did not need to be. This house has mistaken cruelty for concern long enough. A faint color rose in his mother's cheeks. Marcus's smile faded, then returned thinner than before. The visiting ladies found sudden interest in the fire, the carpet, their gloves. Clara remained still, but something in her face changed, not relief exactly, something far more fragile, as if a door within her had opened a single inch, and she feared the wind might close it again. Duchess Margaret rose with offended dignity. You are becoming sentimental. Alexander stood as well. Perhaps I am becoming observant. The tea ended shortly after. Guests left with murmured excuses. Duchess Margaret withdrew to her rooms, and Marcus lingered only long enough to bow over Clara's hand with a politeness that felt like a threat wrapped in silk. When the room emptied, Clara began gathering the cups herself. Alexander moved toward her. Leave them. She continued placing porcelain on the tray. Mrs. Hale has enough to do. Clara. Her name stopped her more effectively than any command. He stood near the table, close enough to see the faint pulse at her throat, far enough not to frighten the careful distance she had built between them. I should have said that sooner. She looked down at the tea stain spreading across one saucer, a small brown moon. Yes. No accusation. One word. Honest as winter. Alexander accepted it because he deserved no softer answer. I do not want you examined like property. That is kind. It is not kindness. His voice roughened despite his effort to control it. It is late. Clara's fingers tightened around the edge of the tray. For one moment, silence stood between them not as punishment, but as something wounded and alive. Then footsteps sounded in the corridor, and she stepped back, once again the composed Duchess of Whitmore. Your Grace, I believe your steward is waiting. He let her go because he had no right to ask her to stay. But that evening, when Alexander returned to his study, Dr. Warren's memorandum was still locked in the drawer, and beside it lay a note from Marcus written in elegant ink. It contained only one sentence. Blackthorn deserves an heir, even if its duke has forgotten the cost of failing to produce one. Alexander read the words twice. Then he opened the drawer, took out the sealed memorandum at last, and held the truth in his hand while the house around him settled into darkness. Alexander opened Dr. Warren's memorandum at midnight, when Blackthorn Hall had gone still enough for truth to sound like a footstep in the dark. The fire in his study had burned low, leaving the room washed in ember light, and outside the windows the winter wind moved through the bare trees with a voice like distant mourning. He broke the fold slowly, though some part of him already knew what waited inside. The physician's words were measured, professional, and devastating in their restraint. The wound Alexander had sustained during the winter campaign had not merely weakened him for a season. It had left a lasting uncertainty where the Whitmore line depended upon certainty. His chance of fathering a child was possible, but unlikely. Possible. Unlikely. Two civilized words, and yet they shook the foundations of every judgment he had allowed to fall upon Clara. He read the memorandum once, then again, then a third time, until the ink seemed to darken beneath his gaze. Clara had known. The broken seal proved it, but more than that, her year of silence proved it. She had stood beneath his mother's contempt, Marcus's insinuations, the pity of visiting ladies, the cold curiosity of servants who pretended not to whisper, and she had said nothing. She had let the accusation settle on her own shoulders because the truth would have stripped him bare before the very world he had been raised to command. Alexander sat down as if his bones had forgotten their purpose. He thought of the linen room, the chapel, the dining table, the moment she had said, "You asked me for no conversation." He had mistaken restraint for emptiness. He had mistaken mercy for obedience. Dawn came pale and colorless. By 10 o'clock, the household was summoned not by Alexander, but by Marcus, who had moved faster than decency and with far more practice. He had arranged a family gathering in the great drawing room under the pretense of discussing succession concerns. Duchess Margaret sat near the hearth, rigid with displeasure. Two distant Whitmore relatives had arrived from neighboring estates, their faces arranged in expressions of solemn interest. Clara stood beside the tea table, dressed in dark green, her fair face composed, her wedding ring catching the weak light. Alexander entered last, carrying the memorandum inside his coat. Before he could speak, Marcus rose. "Cousin, forgive the impropriety, but the matter can no longer be delayed. Blackthorn has endured a year of uncertainty. The estate requires stability. Alexander's eyes moved to Clara. She looked at him once, then away. Marcus continued, his voice smooth enough to make insult seem like service. I have obtained a medical opinion regarding her grace's failure to provide an heir. Clara's hand tightened around the edge of the tea table. Alexander saw the movement. So did Marcus, and his mouth curved faintly. He unfolded a paper. It suggests a condition of delicate concern. Not hopeless, perhaps, but severe enough that the family must consider alternatives. Duchess Margaret closed her eyes as if suffering nobly. One of the older relatives whispered Clara's name with pity sharp as frost. Alexander stepped forward. That is enough. Marcus turned with practiced surprise. I know this pains you, but sentiment cannot preserve a dukedom. No, Alexander said, but lies can poison one. The room went silent. Marcus's expression cooled. Clara looked up. Alexander drew Dr. Warren's memorandum from his coat, but he did not yet open it. You commissioned a false opinion about my wife. Marcus laughed softly. A serious accusation. A simple one. Alexander's voice remained low, and that made every word heavier. You needed Clara blamed because blame is easier to inherit than honor. Duchess Margaret rose halfway from her chair. Alexander, what are you saying? He looked at his mother then, and grief passed through his face like a shadow crossing stone. I am saying the Duchess has borne a humiliation that was never hers. Clara went very still. The room seemed to narrow around her. Alexander unfolded the physician's letter. Dr. Warren's actual memorandum concerns me. Marcus's face changed for the first time. Not much. Only enough. Clara saw it. Duchess Margaret saw nothing but the ruin of pride approaching. Do not, Clara said softly. It was the first time she had spoken without being addressed. Alexander turned to her. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, but with warning, with mercy still reaching for him even now. She was trying to save him again. That knowledge nearly broke him. You have protected me long enough, he said. Then he read the truth aloud, not cruelly, not dramatically, but clearly enough for every polished wall of Blackthorn to hear. When he finished, no one moved. Duchess Margaret sat down as if the chair had been placed behind her by fate. Marcus folded his false paper with fingers no longer steady. Clara remained beside the tea table, pale and silent, but this silence was different. It was not obedience. It was the moment after a bell rings, when the whole air remembers the sound. Alexander crossed the room and stopped before her. He did not touch her. He did not claim forgiveness. Before his mother, his cousin, his relatives, and the house that had misjudged her, Duke Alexander Whitmore bowed his head to his wife. You owed me nothing, he said, and still you gave me your mercy. Clara's lips parted, but no answer came. Perhaps there were some wounds even truth could not close in an instant. Then she removed her wedding ring, placed it gently on the tea table, and every heart in the room seemed to stop. Mercy is not the same as belonging, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried farther than any shout. I think Blackthorn must learn the difference. Then Clara turned and walked from the room, leaving the ring behind like a small circle of sunlight no one there deserved to touch. Clara left Blackthorn Hall before noon with one trunk, one cloak, and no announcement grand enough for gossip. Mrs. Hale wept quietly in the servants' passage, pressing a packet of sandwiches into her hands as if food could protect a heart from breaking. Clara thanked her, kissed the older woman's cheek, and stepped into the waiting carriage without looking back at the stone facade that had been her home and trial for one long year. Snow lay thin across the drive, softening the edges of the world, but not the memory of Alexander's face when she placed the ring upon the table. He had not followed her to the door. For that, she was grateful. A weaker man would have chased her in front of servants, begged loudly, made her pain into a spectacle of his repentance. Alexander had stood in the drawing room as she left, pale and motionless, understanding perhaps for the first time that regret was not a key. The carriage carried Clara 6 miles south to the small house where her mother now lived, a narrow place with blue shutters, a smoking chimney, and a winter garden sleeping beneath frost. Her mother, Mrs. Bennet, rose from her chair when Clara entered, frail but dignified, her silvering hair pinned neatly above a face that had known too many polite disasters. She did not ask whether Clara had been sent away. She simply opened her arms. Clara stepped into them, and, for the first time since her wedding night, allowed herself to be held without having to be useful. Back at Blackthorn, silence did not return to its old shape. It thickened. It accused. Alexander found Clara everywhere and nowhere. Her chair at breakfast remained empty. The chapel candles burned lower because no one replaced them before dawn. The servants performed their duties, but their voices lost their warmth. In the north cottages, children asked when the quiet Duchess would visit again, and their mothers looked toward the hill with worried eyes. On the third day after her departure, Alexander entered the small office Clara had used beside the east pantry. He had never been there before. The room was plain, scarcely larger than a dressing closet, with one narrow window and a desk marked by ink stains. On the shelves stood ledgers in Clara's careful hand. He opened the first and found household expenses reduced by method, not deprivation. He opened the second and found rent extensions recorded for farmers whose crops had failed after early frost. The third held names of servants' children, school fees, boot sizes, winter coats distributed, medical visits paid. Page after page revealed the invisible architecture of her mercy. At the back of the final ledger lay a folded note in Mrs. Hale's hand, perhaps placed there for him to find, or perhaps left by Providence. It read, "Her Grace sold her pearl combs in November to pay for coal after the North Road froze. She said His Grace must not be troubled." Alexander sat in Clara's chair and covered his mouth with his hand. The room held the faint scent of lavender soap and old paper. It was not dramatic sorrow that overcame him, but the smallness of facts. Coal, boots, candles, medicine, ordinary things, gathered one by one, had become the proof that Clara had loved his people better than he had governed them. That evening, Marcus came to the library with injured pride dressed as reason. "You have embarrassed the family," he said. Alexander stood near the fireplace, Clara's wedding ring resting in his palm. "No, I exposed it." Marcus's face hardened. Without an heir, Blackthorn remains vulnerable. Only to men who mistake inheritance for worth. "Careful, cousin." Alexander closed his fingers around the ring. "You will leave Blackthorn by morning. Every account you touched will be reviewed. Every letter you sent will be answered by my solicitor. You wanted this house because you thought it was empty." His voice lowered. "It was not. I was." Marcus left before dawn. Duchess Margaret remained 2 more days, long enough to discover that her son no longer mistook obedience for loyalty. Before she departed, she found Alexander in the chapel, replacing candles with his own hands. "You would humble yourself for her?" she asked from the doorway. Alexander set a flame to the wick and watched it catch. "No," he said quietly. "I am humbled because of her." When his mother was gone, Blackthorn breathed differently. Alexander did not send commands to Clara. He sent no carriage with the Whitmore crest, no demand disguised as concern. Instead, he rode alone to the blue-shuttered house and stopped at the gate, rain darkening his coat, mud staining his boots like any ordinary man's. Clara saw him from the window, but did not come out at once. He waited. For an hour. Then longer. At last, the door opened. She stood beneath the porch roof in a plain gray dress, her hair loosely pinned, her face calm but guarded. Alexander stepped forward only to the bottom stair. Then, in the rain, he knelt, not as a duke performing a gesture, but as a man finally lower than the wound he had made. He placed her ring on the step between them. "I asked you for an heir," he said, his voice rough with the truth. "But you gave me a conscience." Clara looked down at him, and the rain fell softly around them both. She did not reach for the ring. Not yet. And Alexander, who had once demanded everything, bowed his head and asked for nothing more than the right to wait. Clara did not take back the ring that day. She stood beneath the porch roof while rain silvered the road and Alexander knelt on the step below her, waiting with the patience of a man who had finally learned that apology was not the same as repair. At last, she bent, picked up the ring, and closed it inside her palm, not upon her finger. "Go home, Alexander," she said. It was the first time she had spoken his name without title, and the sound of it struck him more deeply than any forgiveness could have. He rose slowly. "May I write to you?" Clara looked past him toward the wet garden, where early snowdrops trembled beneath the bare hedge. "You may write. I do not promise to answer." "I know." And for once, he did know. The weeks that followed became the quietest courtship Blackthorn had ever seen. Alexander wrote every morning before dawn, Not grand letters filled with declarations, but honest ones. He wrote of the North cottages, where new roofs were being laid before spring rain. He wrote of Mrs. Hale, who had scolded him for ordering poor thread and then taught him the difference between useful economy and foolish pride. He wrote of the chapel candles, which he now replaced himself every Thursday. He wrote of the ledgers, not to impress her, but to show he had finally learned how to read the mercy she had left behind. Clara answered only 3 times in 2 months. Her first letter contained 4 words. Do not neglect them. Her second listed the names of 2 children who needed shoes before Easter. Her third asked whether the schoolhouse roof still leaked near the west corner. Alexander kept each letter in the drawer where Dr. Warren's memorandum had once waited like judgment. When spring came, Clara returned to Blackthorn not as a woman surrendering to her husband, but as one entering a house that had been made ready to receive her with respect. No carriage was sent to fetch her. She came in her own time, in the blue dress her mother had mended, with her trunk beside her and the Whitmore ring still on its chain around her neck. The servants lined the hall, but no one cheered. They understood her better than that. Mrs. Hale cried anyway. Alexander stood at the foot of the staircase, dressed plainly, his hands empty. He did not reach for her. "Welcome home, Clara," he said. She looked around at the hall where fires burned brighter, where old rugs had been beaten clean, where the air no longer seemed afraid of warmth. "It is not home because I returned," she replied softly. "It will become home if it learns not to wound what shelters it." "Then teach me," he said. Clara studied him for a long moment. "No, learn beside me." And so he did. The change was not swift, because true change rarely arrives like thunder. It came in smaller weather. Alexander listened at the tenants' meetings instead of merely signing decisions. He asked Mrs. Hale questions and endured her answers. He visited the schoolhouse with Clara and stood awkwardly among children who stared at him as if dukes belonged in storybooks rather than muddy doorways. One child did not stare. His name was Thomas Bell, the orphan grandson of the old servant Clara had once bought medicine for. He was 8 years old, fair-haired, solemn, and fiercely protective of a wooden horse missing one wheel. Clara found him in the chapel one afternoon, trying to hide tears after older boys teased him for having no family name worth speaking of. Alexander entered behind her and stopped at the sight of the boy's stiff little back. For a moment, the Duke saw not an heir, not a solution, not a continuation of blood, but a child standing in the ruins of belonging. Clara knelt beside Thomas and said nothing. She only offered her hand. After a while, the boy took it. 6 months later, before the county magistrate and half the village, Duke Alexander Whitmore publicly named Thomas Bell his lawful son and heir. Duchess Margaret did not attend. Marcus sent no letter. Blackthorn Hall needed neither. Clara stood beside Alexander in a dove-gray gown, the Whitmore ring once again on her finger, while Thomas clutched her hand and tried very hard to look brave. When the papers were signed, Alexander turned not to the crowd, but to Clara. "Is this enough?" he asked quietly. Her eyes softened. "It is a beginning." Years later, people would say the Duchess of Whitmore changed Blackthorn through silence, but that was only half the truth. Her silence had not been emptiness. It had been shelter, judgment, mercy, and finally peace. And Alexander, who once wanted only an heir, learned that a legacy built from blood alone could vanish in 1 generation, but a legacy built from love, humility, and justice could warm a house long after every candle had burned down.